Thank you everybody for joining me tonight. My name is Sylvia Dieckmann, and I will be talking a bit about state management, and in particular about the block pattern in Flutter today. And I'll also report back from my experience with the Flutter puzzle challenge, which happened just last month. Oh wait, I'm in the wrong window. All right. Perfect. Before I jump in, a few words about myself. As you already heard, I'm one of the organizers here. You probably also picked up from my accent. I'm not born in South Africa, but I do live in Stellenbosch for 8 or 9 years already, and more to come. In my day job, I'm a technical manager, although I currently don't work as such. I work mostly as a freelancer. And when I do app development, I mostly do it for fun. Not so much in my day job. I'm not born a mobile developer. I started out in the backend initially and had a long journey through enterprise, through web technologies, and eventually for the last year or two, I have solidly settled on Flutter. Now, if you do think that my bio sounds like I'm all over the place, there's one combining theme in all of this. I really, really love studying new tech. And I spend a lot of time investigating new tech and talking about it. This is kind of why we're here today. All right, let's jump in. Let's talk about state management. So as it turns out, state management is nothing particular to Flutter. I mean, you find it in pretty much every web framework. It's the idea of that your UI is, your app has state, and the function of the state then turns into UI. The UI is a function of state. And again, all the normal app frameworks have this concept behind it. If you look at the official Flutter documentation, they have a long section on state management. And they currently, I counted them, list 14 different approaches, all side by side, all endorsed by Google and the Flutter team. And they actually start out that section, I kid you not, with state management is a complex topic. So, we're in for some trouble here if even the Flutter team says that. But why is it so complex? Well, it doesn't have to be. I mean, we can look at a very simple example. As I said, there are many ways to deal with state management, and probably the easiest one is simply with a stateful widget. And if you ever did a Flutter 101, you probably came across this. You define a stateful widget, which then automatically creates a state object, state class matched with it. In the state class here, I have some payload. So in my case, I defined a very, very simple button, just a toggle button that has states on and off, is selected or not selected. That gets initialized, and eventually in my build method, I call another widget, and in the onChanged callback, I call another callback called setState, and in this setState method, I actually update my state whenever that is necessary. Now, the setState call is important because that's actually the trigger for the stateful widget to update itself, to rebuild itself. This works perfectly. There is nothing wrong with it. It gets you started quickly. However, you do realize if your app gets more and more complex, you have a lot of functionality within this one state class here and within this set state method. So if your business logic gets a little more complicated, like, I don't know, you switch to different colors depending on the state, eventually it becomes incredibly hard to maintain. So that's why stateful widget is good to get you started. And if your app is simple enough, maybe it brings you all the way. But chances are eventually you're looking for something else. And so this is where FlutterBLoC comes in. Again, block is nothing particular to Flutter. It's a design pattern. I think it was first described in 2018, I believe, in at some conference. So it's a generally applicable design pattern, and it has been implemented in Flutter through the block and FlutterBLoC packages, but has been implemented in other frameworks as well. The word block stands for business logic component, and the idea is that you create a very, very clear separation between the UI and the business logic. So you create an actual class for the business logic that is encapsulating the state. And then the UI communicates with the block and vice versa only through streams of events one way and streams of state changes the other way. So if the UI, if something happens, like let's say the user clicks on a button, the UI will issue an event which will be captured by the block, will be analyzed according to the business logic, and then whatever the business logic subscribes, eventually there'll be a state change. And the state change is in return observed by the UI and causes the UI to update. Same happens in the back end. If there's a data change, for example, some new Firestore data coming in, same thing, it gets negotiated with the block. The block eventually might or might not trigger a state change, and that can be observed by the UI. So this architecture allows for very, very clean separation of concerns, which is kind of the biggest advantage of this pattern. How might this work? Well, let's look again at a super trivial button example. Now, this is really trivial, but I mean, bear with me, that's the best I could fit on a slide. I'll start out with a simple state class here, and I only have one, and my payload is again just this Boolean value. Typically, state classes, most people define them as immutable and comparable. That makes it easier for the observer to detect when a state change happens. And in my case here, I have only one state change, but in a more complex example, you might have a lot more. Oops, sorry, wrong button. The matching event, again, I only have one, but there might be more. In my case, I just define a button pressed event with no extra payload, super trivial. And then these two come together in the block, in the button block. So here you see the event is part of it and the state is part of it. This block, the most important piece is a callback for each event. So in my case, I only have the button pressed event. So there's this callback that gets the new event. I can observe I can inspect the event, and based on my business logic, eventually there'll probably be a new state emitted. In my case, I admit this button state that has just a payload reversed to the value reversed to whatever it was. So this is pretty much all. Somewhere else in the code, in a completely different place, I would use this block now. I would most likely access it with a provider, through a provider, and I'll talk a little more on the next slide about what that is. And then, for example, when this button is actually pressed, the button widget might call the button block through the provider, add a new event button pressed, and then handle everything else and just wait for a state change to update itself. Now, this was the block component, the block package. There's also a matching FlutterBLoC package, and that has a bunch of widgets which make integration much simpler. By the way, Qubit think of it as a simplified block. It's for all intents and purposes behaves very similar. So the widget that you most likely come across if you use this technique is the block provider. Or multi-block provider if you have several in one go. You might also have the repository provider. And then the other four are the consumers. And the differences are subtle. For example, the builder rebuilds every time the state that it depends on changes automatically. The listener rebuilds only one time, so that would be appropriate for events that shouldn't be happening more than once. And there are subtle differences between between the selector and the consumer as well. I won't go into detail here in when to use them. I think the documentation is really good there. And typically, once you have your use case, it all makes a lot of sense. But ultimately, you have lines like this in your code. You have, for example, if you want to determine the current value of a button, you might set this observer and basically observe just the isSelected value of the state. It's actually a nice thing. So it serves a bit as a filter. If other aspects of the state update, this element would not rebuild, but if the isSelected value updates, whatever depends on this value will be rebuilt. And yeah, this is, I think, the way to emit a new event. We already talked about that. All right. So this is where I admit that I'm a little in trouble. I probably noticed that I was squirming a bit when I came to the example because it can get very complex very quickly, or seemingly. I've been aware of the block pattern for quite a while, and I repeatedly looked at it, worked through a few tutorials, and always ended up with, like, the tutorial was a lot longer than I expected. There's a lot of boilerplate to create. You know, you have to create a state class, preferably a state directory. Some people have an event directory. It gets rather messy rather quickly. And at the end of a tutorial, you have like a button or a glorified hello world, really. So until now, I was not impressed really, and what I basically came away with is that block is probably cool, but just not worth it for the type of apps I'm writing. Relatively small, relatively prototypical. So this is my old life. In my new life, everything changed, and it changed when I did the Flutter Puzzle Challenge. So to tell you a little bit what that is about, the Flutter team issued a challenge in January, and I think it's the second time they did this. They gave developers 6 weeks to implement a game in a competition. And the rules were fairly laid back. You know, everything goes, it has to run on Flutter, and it has to be a slider puzzle. But, you know, however you interpret that, you know, it's up to you. Now, what they did is they helped us along a little bit. They published an example, and that example was written by a consulting company called Very Good Ventures. If you are in the Flutter space, you might have heard about them. They do lots of work, publish lots of popular packages. And among many things, the original author of the block package also works for them. So not surprisingly, their code contains blocks all over, and is in generally really, really well written. I tremendously enjoyed studying their code, and I found the way they structured it very easy to understand and also really, really easy to extend for my purpose. So, and what I realized is, as I studied this example that uses blocks in a more complex context than any tutorial can ever do, it started to make sense. And I found that through extending their code, through basically interacting with the blocks they defined already and defining my own on top of it, it was easily possible for me to write my own puzzle version kind of as an extension. So in the end, I published my competition submission is the Einmal Eins puzzle. The name is a bit of a word game. Einmal Eins in German literally means 1 by 1. And it's what German kids would call timetables. So a German kid would say, oh, we are learning the 1 by 1s in school when they meet timetables. So that's where the name came from. Now let's quickly look at the game. Let me see if yes, works perfect. All right, so let's start with the demo code. So on top here, you see 4 different tabs, and the last 2 tabs are more or less the plain vanilla demo. So this is what we were given by Very Good Ventures. So here, for example, this is the very, very basic. So just to remind you what a slider puzzle actually is, let me demonstrate. You shuffle it, and then you start to slide and slide the tiles back. Now, I'm not going to solve this puzzle live while talking to you, so let's not even attempt. But I mean, you get the idea, and you probably remember it. The second version of their game is a little more interesting. I'm not sure you can actually hear the sound, but there is cool sound effects. There's also a lot of animation. So let me start that. You get this countdown sequence, some clicking, some jizzling, and then again, you can start sliding. There should be sound as well, but it might not be audible. And then the other interesting thing is you can switch to different themes. Again, sound enabled. And yeah, lots of animations, lots of different concepts on this page alone. So let me go back to my slide. All right. When you look at the code, I did look at the code, and I found there basically 6 different blocks defined in their code, and I added another 7 or actually 8, I think, to it. Now, don't memorize this list. That's not important, but let me show you where they are. So this is a screenshot. Oh, by the way, I forgot one very crucial thing. I quickly have to back up. Sorry for that slight oversight. I showed you their code, but of course I also need to show you mine. This is not the demo. Right. All right. So sorry for that. So I stopped here at the VGV code, but let's see what I made of it. I wrote a math puzzle, which is basically multiplication here, and then the results, kind of the result in each tile. If you start this game, everything gets shuffled. And now you have to slide the things. For example, the 30 goes here, this tile here goes up in the corner. So you need to slide it up there. Again, I'm not going to do that on live TV, but you get the point. You have different modes here. Like, for example, I personally think Roman numbers are a lot of fun. But since we are all geeks in this room, might also like binary, there is, you can choose various degrees of complexity. If you play this, you will very quickly find that it is devilishly hard. And you also probably catch on the general idea here on trying to trick little kids into practicing their multiplication tables. And I didn't want them to get too hung up on the actual sliding puzzle and think more about their math. So I secretly put in a second mode, which I call swap mode, which is exactly the same as the sliding. It's just that the mechanics are slightly different. So in this game, in this mode, once it started, you can jump from, you can kind of swap the tile from any position into the correct position. So here, for example, I'm swapping the 36 in there. This should be a 45. And this one, I would actually have a chance of solving while talking to you. Let's move on. I also have a leaderboard here and a local history and a few other features, including like translation. So let's go back to my slide and go back to this little detour. I already talked about that. And yes, this is where we stopped. I started showing you where my different blocks are. And I'm starting with basically their version, the initial version that they gave us. So what do we have? We have the audio control block, which is basically muting and unmuting. We have a timer block. This one is starting to tick once the game is started. We have a theme block where you can switch between the different games. Initially only 2 themes, later 4. The name is slightly unfortunate because they also use themes to describe the blue, green, and yellow theme here. So it probably would have been easier to call this one, I don't know, type block or mode block or something. But I mean, minor problem. A puzzle block, this one is the biggest of them all because this describes the puzzle state. It has functionality to generate a new puzzle. It remembers which tiles are where, how many are in the correct position, how many moves the user has done already. All of that is encapsulated in the puzzle block. A dash data puzzle block deals with the startup sequence and the kind of whether the game has been started, finished, or is currently in this countdown modus. The boundary between the two, between puzzle block and dash data puzzle block, was not always completely clear to me. So quite a few times I actually had to look at, had to search for a certain element of a state that I was looking for, figure out which block it belonged to. But I mean, it makes sense the way they did. It is not completely trivial to second guess later. And then the last block they used was the dash tile theme block, and that's to switch between the different colors and different images. All right. In my own version, I built on that. I added the language control block that just toggles between German and English just for exercise sake. I have a settings block. And this one is interesting. It's fairly straightforward. I mean, how much different settings can you do? But every time a setting changes, lots of different components, lots of different widgets observe the setting. So when a setting changes, pretty much the entire page rebuilds. For example, there's a new leaderboard being fetched. There's a new local history being fetched. Of course, the puzzle itself gets reset. So, I mean, lots of things happen once you change the setting. LeaderBLoC. The leaderboard, by the way, is maintained in Firestore. And the history block, that's only my local history in chronological time, that's maintained in shared preferences. In a real production app, I would put both in Firestore, but here for kicks and giggles, I thought it would be cute to have like two different storage mechanisms and compare them. Then I have the login block. Because I was too afraid of South African POPI regulations and all the T's and C's and whatever you, I only support anonymous authentication. But because an anonymous ID is so boring to see in a leaderboard, I assign every new user at sign up a unique string so that you at least have some memorable string that you can recognize yourself with. So I've been playing for the last few days as check price. And then finally, there is the mslide and mswap puzzle blocks. The two are almost similar, almost identical. I initially envisioned the two puzzle modes to diverge significantly. In the end, they were almost the same. So if I do it again now, I would probably combine these two blocks. But this was a game with deadline. I didn't have time for that. So I wish I could walk you a little more through the code now, but you probably get more out of it if you look at it at your own time. I would, if you get serious about starting with the block pattern, I really encourage you to look at the VG Ventures code. And I would suggest you start with the audio control or the timer block. Both are fairly simple, simple states, simple events, clear transitions, and then you can see like various call sites where these blocks are called and observed. Once you've mastered that, look at the puzzle block, which is the most complex of them. And there you can see really the benefit of having your business logic not mingled with your UI changes and why that is such a cool thing. All right, I'm almost at the end. Few conclusions first on the technical side. I'm quite impressed with the block pattern in retrospect. I think it made it provided for really clear structure, made understanding and modifying somebody else's code extremely easy. And I think I would definitely. I mean, it's not the only state management technique, but it's definitely one that I will add to my repertoire. Sometimes I found defining the correct states or events. So when I made mistakes, when I found myself at a dead end and had to kind of undo the last few hours of work, it was typically because I got that wrong. I defined the wrong states or the wrong state transitions or so, or put them in the wrong block, something like that. So I think that requires the most thought. And that's also for me the reason why reading tutorials alone is not enough, because tutorials are always so simplified that this kind of stuff, like really, you have lots of states that depend on each other, lots of interaction you want to model. How do you do that? That you see most likely in a more complex example. One thing I noticed is that I'm very used to exploring new code with a debugger. So I really step through it with a debugger and kind of find my way around that way. And that works less well with the block pattern just because it depends on streams and asynchronicity. You have to be a bit careful about kind of catching your debuggable events again through a new breakpoint. But I mean, that's a minor complaint. You get used to it. It's just something I noticed that I had to adjust my habits a little bit. So overall, I'd say it's absolutely, it's quite a steep learning curve, more than with other state management techniques that I tried before. But it's worthwhile. But if you don't feel it's worthwhile, then do yourself a favor and also look at some real examples. Maybe you change your mind. Now, on the puzzle hack conclusions, I have to say, like, yay. It is lots and lots of fun. I really enjoyed it. I spent a tremendous amount of time on this. I got very ambitious after a while. But I feel that I did it mostly because I felt I was learning a lot. You know, it was a completely new type of exercise for me. And I feel it improved my understanding of a lot of different things, not only the block pattern. And so I think I was getting a lot of benefit. If you decide to do a challenge like this, maybe don't do it to just win. I mean, the main prize is a laptop, and I would love to win. But I was one of about 5,500 registrants. So the chance that they pick my submission is like about this one. But it doesn't matter because I think I got everything out of it. I had a good time and enjoyed it, and that's all that matters. So last slide, references. I wish I could, I talked a lot about tutorials here, and I wish I could kind of recommend a good one to you, and I tried. There are so many out there that I had a hard time selecting. So pick one that suits you, that you feel comfortable with. Do pay a little bit of attention to the publishing date, because the block pattern went through quite an evolution and changed API. And so some of the really old tutorials might not work out of the box anymore. I mean, you can adjust it, but it's always nicer to kind of be able to copy and paste from the tutorial straight into your code without further thinking, at least in the beginning. And yeah, and then please check out the game and play around and see if you can beat my nephews. It was written for them, with them in mind. And so let's see if you can beat a 7-year-old. And yeah, that's it. And do we have questions?
Thank you for that interesting topic on block. From your experience with working with state management, how do you rate block compared to the other ones you worked with?
So the other state management system that I've used many times, aside from the plain, so I would always first look at a stateful widget. You know, often that gets you a long way, and you know, if it works, by all means, use it. I've used Riverpod extensively, and I also really like that. And I haven't quite made up my mind. I don't think I'll ever kind of switch to one over the other permanently. I think both Riverpod and BLoC have their reason to be, and I would probably at this point pick BLoC for more complex applications. Yeah, I think either one, you can't go wrong. And I did think a lot about this over the last few weeks and read quite a bit of different articles. And basically, it seems, I don't know, it's a question like VI or Emacs or so. People have strong opinions one way or another. Their opinions aren't always terribly rational. I think at this point, I'm still on the fence about it. I will continue to use both techniques. But I do feel, at least, so the last few weeks have changed my mind insofar that I do think BLoC is a serious contender now. Before I had dismissed BLoC outright and said, you know, it's just not worth it.
Okay, thank you. Alistair has a question for you. Since BLoC might be complex, which use case are suited best for it?
I think it shines in a scenario where changed state transitions are non-trivial, and you observe that state all over the place. Like, for example, let me see if I can quickly go back to one thing. Let's see, what I want to get to is, well, this will do. This slide here, you see the puzzle state, and then here you see 0 moves, 15 tiles. And so there'll be different widgets in different branches of your widget tree. and they both kind of need the same information, like, how many tiles have been solved, are in the correct position, how much is left, how much has already been done, are we done yet? And the block makes it very easy to define a complex state object and then observe it in different places. And from there on, don't stress anymore about whether you have to rebuild that, whether the information has changed. It will change automatically when your state changes. So I think that's a scenario where BLoC worked really well for me, where basically many different widgets depend on one piece of information.
Okay. Let me see if there are any other questions that have been raised in the chat. Maya asks, I wonder if the block pattern is closer to MVI or to MVVI, or is there no comparison?
I'm sure there is, and I throw that question back to the Flutter community. I normally don't pay that much attention to the theory of these architectures, so I'm not the best person to answer that question. But I'm sure people have an opinion on it, and I see there are quite a few Flutter developers. So please give your opinion to Maya in the chat.
Definitely. All right. Let me see if there's any questions maybe I've missed around. Oh, Ewald asks, are you going to become a full-time game developer now?
Am I a Flutter what developer?
Are you going
Flutter
to become
full-time game developer?
Yeah.
I feel I already am. I'm not doing it for clients. No, it seems like most of the apps I'm writing, because I typically want to demonstrate or try out some new technology, and I quite often pick some little game idea, but it's always a bit of a novelty idea. And a lot of my ideas come out of interactions with my family. So this game, for example, is literally, I visited my nephews over Christmas. I saw them struggling, or just not struggling, but whining. I said, oh, do we have to practice math again? And I figured, oh, I can make that fun. And so that's how, I'm basically just learning Flutter and trying out things, but hey, that's just a good opportunity as any to write a little game from it.
Well, but it's been a very interesting game that you've made, and I do believe there's a use case for it for teaching and learning, which is one of the best things for the kids to learn some new skill, but also make it interesting for them to not get bored. Right. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you.
You're welcome.